What the theme that we're doing in this series of presentations is we've been talking first about the power of the COVID experience and all the stress that's going on in our country right now to actually create enough pressure on some people that they really rise and grow and resolve problems that have been haunting them for a long time. And that's the area I chose to talk about first was about alcoholism, just because I had 4 people in my practice who had been kind of playing with their alcoholism for a while in therapy, and once this came on and they feel the additional pressure and being closed in quarantine and COVID, it pushed them to really look at themselves and do better. So that was our first presentation. The next one we went to, we talked about this whole phenomenon of, in this case we're talking about women who marry alcoholics, but there's a similar pattern with males, but we'll get to that one. But we talked about how that really eerie thing that we all have come to understand from an early time, which is that daughters of alcoholics marry alcoholics, which is just bizarre. It's most bizarre because the story I told you, the first person she married, he wasn't drinking at all when she met him. That in fact, they were young, they were in high school, and it was only after they'd married that he began to develop the problem. So that makes this all the more eerie. But it absolutely occurs, and it doesn't just occur in this situation, it occurs in everything. We carry programs that sabotage us. And so what we've talked about in this one we said is the unresolved wounds and fears of childhood cause us quite unintentionally and ironically to actually recreate the dynamics and wounds of our childhood and our adult lives. And so now we're going to talk, we talked about how this develops. We talked about how growing up with the alcoholic dad, she developed a series of beliefs, feelings, physiological responses to those that developed anxiety and depression, and behavioral style that ended up just continuing to recreate her history in 3 marriages in a row with 3 different kinds of addictions. And so now we're going to talk about, so what do we do? If we don't just say, hey, stop doing that, and here's a list of things to look for in addicted men, but instead we say we're going to really help you to heal, what does that healing mean? So I'm going to walk this through. This isn't always this way, but it's a good way to understand it. What we have here, this thing I've called a biopsychosocial model I talked about that I developed in my master's program many decades ago. And it's a way of understanding how we develop our problems, how they're maintained, and how we resolve them. And it tries to pull in all the different aspects of self. And so I've actually called this a number of different things. This is what I called it when we taught at the medical school, a biopsychosocial model, because that's something that they require medical students and residents to learn how to do, is to really understand the integration of our environmental experiences, our psyche, and our physiology in terms of the problems that we deal with. And so I kind of like this term, although I use a lot of other ones for this model as well. Now, we're going to talk about intervention. So when somebody comes to you, the first thing that is most critical, I've referenced before, is that necessity is the mother of invention. Okay, what that means is we have to get to a point of hurting so badly that we will do whatever we can to really grow and become that best person that we have the capacity to be. Until we reach that miserable place, AA calls that hitting bottom. They didn't invent that concept, they just marketed it well. But it's the idea of that people have to hurt a certain amount to really get the drive they need to overcome this. And so the first thing when we have this woman we were talking about, she's had this happen 3 times in her life. Her life has been a living nightmare. She's ready for help. Okay? But that's the first thing you got to have. You can bring the most brilliant things to people who are not ready, and they just won't get it. They have to go out and suffer some more because of what they're doing. So you don't wish that for them, but it's just kind of how human beings are. So we want first that. We've got that with her. So the next thing we do is, the way I look at it is we look at the things that we can do that are most practical and most concrete. What's the first things that we can do for her? Okay? So in this case, one is interventions which are physiological. Okay? That she is miserable. She is anxious. She's depressed. She's just dragging around. She can barely function. She is so miserable. And so is medicine the answer in therapy? No. But it really is a really valuable thing as a part of therapy. You know, what medicine is, what these antidepressants are. And I can remember an era when we didn't have this really high quality. The antidepressants that used to exist when I was first in my career were not nearly as good as these are. These things are very effective medicines. They really do help to rectify your neurochemistry. They don't make you high. They just help you to remanage the neurochemistry that you have, to bring back serotonin levels, bring back norepinephrine levels and dopamine levels so that you can just feel normal. And so it's a great thing to help people with at the beginning. The only downside with medicine is that it works. And for those people whose motivation is marginal, it's really easy for them to come to believe that, okay, now I have my solution, I feel better, so everything's fine. So that's the one thing you got to guard is the fact that these do work well. And so we'll say in here, we'll say some kind of medications, okay? We'll talk another time about what these medications are. The most common ones you use in this kind of situation are called serotonin selective reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs, which are Prozac, Celexa, Lexapro, Zoloft, Paxil, a new one called Vibrid that's much more expensive because it's still under patent. And what they do is they raise the serotonin level. There's also SNRIs, but like I said, we'll talk about all that in another presentation. But probably get her on some kind of medication to just help her to be okay, so where she can function and use therapy. The next thing we do in terms of our interventions, whether it's with this or any situation, typically you start with physiology, and then I go over here to environmental factors. Because in both cases, these are very concrete things you can do. Okay, now let me also make the point that said, also I'm going to work with her on relaxation. Nowadays, I'm going to have her get the Calm app or the Headspace app or the Breathe app, one of those, and start using it where she can not only feel better, but can learn how to relax better. I'm going to get her doing some cardio exercise, because not only does it help us with relaxation, it also releases a half a dozen neurotransmitters, neuropeptides that have to do with energy, improved mood, and improved outlook. So while we're doing those things physiologically, then we come over here to environment. Well, you know, if she is still in that situation, then that's a problem, okay? If she wants out, then you need to help her get out. Even if she doesn't want out, sometimes in a situation like this, if the partner is somebody who's still practicing their problem, sometimes this person needs to leave just because they need to make a strong enough statement to get this other person's attention. So one way or another, you're likely to do something environmental. If in fact you have somebody here who's actually wanting to get help, then you're going to involve that person in therapy. That's an environmental intervention. So one way or another, you're going to do something about her circumstances that help her to be in a situation that's more likely to work for her. It's really hard to just keep doing therapy with somebody who keeps walking back into a situation that just keeps punching the holes in the bottom of her boat. And so that's our second thing, very concrete interventions that we make. And this may include couple therapy, or it may include referral to an attorney, or whatever. The next thing we go to is I guess we'll go to behavioral. Behavioral makes sense as connected to this. Behavioral means behavioral psychology, although it's a very complex discipline. What it really means is behavioral psychology is like the Nike thing, okay? Just do it, okay? If you're doing the wrong thing, let's do the right thing. Let's do something that makes more sense, something that works better. And so what you can get in this is that this person, whatever coping strategies we have developed that are hardwired into us, under stress, we just do it more intensely, okay? And so, you know, even when she's in a situation, she's likely to become a more intense people pleaser. She's likely to become more perfectionistic, trying to be perfect enough to make it okay. And so you really have to introduce a whole new way of relating in the world. And so what we know, and we talked about, when we talked about the practicing alcoholic, we talked about there's an Al-Anon program for spouses or family members or loved ones of people who have addiction problems. That is more heavily filled with females, but not as much as it used to be, because unfortunately, as women have found their way in the world, they now, you know, get much more of an alcoholic, which is not really the goal of women evolving in their role, but it's just a byproduct of it. But most commonly, it's still going to be women. And so it's about learning to do what they call detachment with love, okay, which is, okay, your problem is your problem. I still care about you, but I'm not going to be in the middle of it. I'm not going to allow your dysfunction to be damaging my life. And that can take different forms. One, I can detach when I'm in the house with you, although that's really hard, or I can just leave with the kids and say, I can't be here, the kids can't be here. I will never make that choice for people. They have to make that choice for themselves. If I try to convince them of it, it doesn't go well. They need to decide that for themselves. But it's still detachment with love. It changes the dynamic. And what you begin to understand is that, and one of the things I like to say a lot about this whole concept about how complex love your neighbor as yourself really means. And so on one hand, when we talk about love and what you hear from the pulpit on Sundays, and I do go to church on Sundays, I believe what they say, but what you often hear about love is, if there is a problem, do more for others, give more to others, tolerate more from others. Okay? True to a point. Okay? For a lot of us, we're way too good at that and not so good at the other one. And the other one is expect of, require of, and set limits and boundaries. That's also critical to creating a loving experience. And so what this woman begins to discover is that by doing more of this, expect of, require of, and set limits and boundaries, versus do, forgive, to, or tolerate, she actually is loving somebody more effectively. That she is helping somebody be motivated to be a better person, and she is ultimately making herself and her life better. And that's a new concept, okay? And so that's where we go in terms of behavior, which then rolls right up to thought pattern, okay? Thought pattern stuff, like I said, this is actually, thought pattern stuff we talk about is an area of psychology called cognitive psychology. Cognitive psychology says the way I interpret the world has everything to do with how I then feel, which then leads to how I act, which then leads to how the world treats me, which then gives me feedback on what I did, okay? The problem is that what happens, as I said before, is that we tend to just intensify what we've done, thinking if I do a better job of it, it's going to bring me something different. So she has to begin to see the world very differently. One is going to work with issues about her own self-worth, begin to work with the idea that says, I'm trapped in this idea of empowering everybody I meet with the ability to approve or disapprove of me. you know? And then I really have to begin to understand that the world is very different than, it isn't all my dad. So there are some people who are just going to be very accepting of me. But I need to be strong enough and think enough of myself that basically it doesn't matter. I'm going to do the best thing I know how to do in the situation to be fair to all parties, and then people need to live with it. So that's what you would call cognitive psychology. We'll do presentations on that, a lot more complicated than that, but that's a good start. Now, as we move through all these things and we get that person going and she begins to kind of get her feet on the ground and she begins to feel more confident in what she's doing and so on, and she's getting a better control of her circumstances and she feels a little bit better, then we want to go a lot deeper, okay? Because what we know is that when we think about levels of depth in psychology, the most superficial interventions are environmental, okay? Because that's not even me, that's just my circumstances, okay? So they call that in psychology, call that the geographic cure. If I change where I am, things will be better. But that is an important piece, but it's just a surface. The next one in terms of depth is behavioral. Behavioral psychology is I'm acting different. But the thing is, if my insides haven't changed, then we know eventually that behavior is going to go away. And so the next level we go to is thought pattern, our beliefs. We begin to think differently, that's stronger. But the real core of it is our feelings, okay? That stuff is hardwired into our amygdala, our limbic system, the deeper parts of our brain that have to do with survival. They're basically the emotion centers of our brain. And that stuff has enough power to override everything else. And that's the thing you got to kind of recognize about how we work. And so we get into a much deeper kind of therapy here. And this gets into the realm of what I like to refer to as emotion-focused therapies. Sometimes these are called trauma resolution therapies, but it really is, those therapies are a little bit broader than that. It's not just about trauma. It's about things which are embedded deeply in you emotionally that you even know better than, but you just cannot override that incredibly powerful feeling. And in truth, if it didn't work that way, my career almost wouldn't exist. Because if we could just override how we feel with rational thought, I'd probably be working one day a week. But it's much more powerful to get in that stuff. And so there's a whole class of therapies which I would call emotion-focused therapies. The ones that I have gravitated towards the most in recent years because they're just the cleanest, they go right to the issue, and within a 50-minute therapy hour, you can genuinely have somebody leave going, wow, I just feel better. I feel like I've kind of let something go. You know, one lady said real early on, I remember one lady talked about, she went back home and she opened a soda and it went, she said, oh, that's what just happened to me. I just let off that pressure. And so that's the most intense kind of thing. And so like I said, the things that I use in therapy, and we'll do some other presentations about these techniques specifically, is back when we first started doing this kind of work in the early 80s, when my wife and I were working with the National Children's Advocacy Center, and we were part of the original task force that created that center. We then got a real flood of adults who were looking for treatment for some horrible childhood abuse histories. And we really had to go looking for something more powerful than the cognitive behavioral therapy that we had been taught in our graduate school. And the thing we finally found that we grabbed a hold of it first was stuff that really goes all the way back to Sigmund Freud's original work. And what he would do when he was first working was, once he'd done a history, he would lay people back on his Freudian couch, he would put them in a light state of trance. Now, what trance is really a good description for therapeutic trance is a relaxed state of focused concentration where your mind is more on feelings and sensations than it is on thoughts. So we're not going to make you act like a chicken or anything, okay? And you're going to remember what you did. But it lets us create that interface with the emotion centers of your brain, okay? And so we're much more working on feelings and thoughts. And then what we do is he would connect to this, and we did this for many years, connect to it and allow those feelings to carry you backwards in time. And what they do is they take you to one or more experiences which are at the roots of these feelings, okay? And so you would go back and deal with these traumas. I mentioned some of that work early in this presentation. You'll resolve those traumas in a process that we'll get into when I do a presentation on this kind of therapy. And in so doing, you genuinely release that wound. And people's neurochemistry changes. They are able to genuinely release these wounds. Now, if you have a complex and traumatic history, it ain't like this is a one-time cure, okay? For the people who have the most horrible histories, and I've treated a number of people with multiple personality disorder and things, or what now is called dissociative identity disorder, these people have thousands of horrible experiences. So this is, for these people, these are years and years of therapy. But that doesn't necessarily, for some people, they get a great benefit of a few sessions because they don't have the same history. But the point being that we want to do that deeper kind of healing work. There's another kind of technique that I do all the time, and I really ask that all the associates that come into my practice do is we get them all trained in doing a technique called EMDR, which stands for eye movement, desensitization, reprocessing. And this is one of those things that in my career, actually both these things, both the hypnotic one and this one, my first response was, that's just the dumbest thing I ever read. I can't believe they're writing that. And it does. It sounds ridiculous. It is like magic. It is a phenomenally effective technique for helping people to genuinely erase, resolve, and release even the most horrible kind of traumas. And what it does is it taps into that natural healing process that the brain does in sleep, and particularly in REM sleep. So I'm not going to talk a lot about those techniques right now. That's going to be set aside for another presentation. But what we see then is this, is that when I can get down to this deepest stuff and really get it resolved, then what you see is that from there, we move out. Once I get some resolution on that emotion, and one of the things I've said a lot is that our mental clarity and competence around any issue and our emotional intensity about that issue work in inverse proportion. The more loaded I am with emotion about something, the less capable I am. The more I can resolve that emotion, the more clear and competent I become. And so that's what these techniques do. They genuinely diffuse those issues of their power. Once you do that, then your ability to make those cognitive shifts, those thinking level shifts, comes much more naturally because you can see things more clearly. You're not so burdened by your history. Then make those behavioral shifts comes much more easily too because you're not burdened by the emotion. And finally, then you impact the world in a very different way because you're coming from a different place. And so it's not to devalue anything we're doing here because all aspects of this are what therapy is. But in essence, this is how therapy works. And I'm always, in every session, I'm dancing among those different processes. And with the young man I just finished working with, once I'd done the feeling work, then we go, okay, what does that change about, and what we were talking about, life philosophy. How does that change your life philosophy? How do you see the world differently? How do you see your relationship with the world differently? What strategies are you going to use to make the world differently? Where you put yourself in the world, how you relate in the world differently. When we do all that, that's real healing and growth. People really evolve through that. They heal their wounds. They evolve. They become better, wiser, stronger people. And so if you've enjoyed this presentation, please sanitize and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next presentation.